They tied him to a tree and left him for the wolves. Not just any tree. A massive, ancient ponderosa pine that stood like a gnarled sentinel on the edge of the ridge, its roots clawing at the rocky soil as if trying to hold on against the endless sky. Below, the Dragoon Mountains fell away into a sea of broken boulders and sagebrush. It was a place of endings, a place where the sun baked the earth until it cracked and the wind carried the scent of death. His name was Keo Redhawk. He was a Chiricahua Apache, 30 years old, with shoulders made broad by a life of riding and fighting. But none of that mattered now. His wrists were bound behind him with rawhide, pulled so tight the cord had already broken the skin. Another rope circled his chest, pinning him to the sticky, resin-weeping bark of the great pine. He could feel the sap clinging to his hair, a sweet, cloying smell that mingled with the copper tang of his own blood. The man who pronounced his sentence was Elder Nash Doe, a man whose face was a roadmap of hardship, every line carved by wind and time. He held the war stick, the symbol of judgment. "You led them to the soldiers." The elder's voice was low, but it cut through the wind like a flint knife. 6 of our brothers did not return from the canyon pass. The white riders knew the way. Keo's jaw tightened, a knot of muscle bunching beneath his skin. "I led no one. I rode to find water." A murmur rippled through the circle of 20 warriors who had brought him here. They were his kin, men he had hunted with, bled with. Now their faces were stone. His younger cousin, Tony, stood among them. But when Keo's eyes met his, Tony looked away, and that gaze, that single cowardly glance, cut deeper than any rawhide. "You took coin from them," Nash Doe insisted. "The traitors' silver." "I took no coin." Keo's voice was steady, a rock against the tide of accusation. "What I have, I earned with my own hands." The elder tapped the war stick against the packed earth, a final, hollow sound. "We cannot carry a viper in our basket. You will not return to our fires." They didn't beat him. They didn't strike him. They did something far worse. A young warrior, his eyes as cold and dead as river stones, stepped forward with a thin-bladed knife. He didn't say a word. He simply drew the blade across Keo's forearm, a shallow cut, but deep enough. Blood welled up instantly, dark red against his sun-browned skin. It trickled down his arm, dripping from his fingertips onto the thirsty dust below. A faint, cruel smile touched the young man's lips. "The wolves will smell it," he said in Apache. Keo met his gaze unblinking. "And perhaps they will smell your fear when you sleep." The smile vanished. They left a small rawhide pouch at the base of the tree. It was an empty gesture, a pretense of leaving sustenance, but Keo knew it was hollow. As they turned to leave, Keo noticed something odd. The pouch wasn't entirely flat. There was a tiny lump inside, something they'd missed, or perhaps left intentionally. A final insult. Then one by one they walked away, their shadows stretching long in the dying sun until the sound of their footsteps was swallowed by the immense silence of the high desert. He was alone. He tested the bindings, the rawhide biting into his flesh. The knots were slick with his sweat in the tree's sap, pulled impossibly tight. He could shift an inch, maybe 2, but no more. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. And as the light failed, the hunters woke up. It started with a single, long, low howl that drifted up from the sage flats. An answer came almost immediately, closer and sharper. Then another and another, a rising chorus that seemed to wrap around the ridge. The air itself was hunting him. He saw them then, gray shapes sliding between the boulders, fanning out, their heads low. The alpha, a heavy-shouldered brute with a pale ruff, kept its yellow eyes locked on him. They were circling, testing, letting the smell of blood and fear do their work. A bead of sweat slid down Keo's temple. Not from fear. Not yet. It was from the strain of holding perfectly still, of conserving every ounce of strength for a fight he could not possibly win. The wolves crept closer. The alpha was just 20 paces away now, its lips curled back in a silent snarl. The pack flowed around it, a river of gray death closing in. Keo braced his boots against the tree's roots, every muscle in his body screaming. Night was falling fast. The killers were here. He flexed his hands against the bonds until the skin burned. and that's when he heard it. Over the sound of the wind and his own thundering heart, another sound. Faint at first, the rhythmic beat of hoof on leather, hoof beats coming up the trail. The wolves heard it too. Their ears pricked. The alpha's head lifted, its nostrils flaring, torn between the easy meal pinned to the tree and the unknown approaching from the dark. The hoofbeats grew louder, steadier, accompanied by the creak of saddle leather and the faint jingle of a stirrup buckle. Keo didn't call out. He didn't know if this new arrival was a friend or another foe. Then a voice cut through the dusk, firm and unhurried. "Easy, girl." It was a woman's voice, and the lead wolf bared its teeth, not at Keo, but at the approaching shadow. The game had just changed. The silhouette that emerged from the twilight was a dun-colored mare, picking its way carefully along the narrow trail. The rider sat bolt upright, the brim of her hat pulled low. A rifle was sheathed in a scabbard on the saddle, but her hand rested on the stock as if it were an extension of her own arm. She reined in the mare at the edge of the clearing, her eyes taking in the entire scene in a single, sharp glance. The man, the tree, the circle of wolves. There was no fear on her face, only a cold, hard calculation. She swung her leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground, her boots hitting the dirt with a solid thud. The wolves shifted, uneasy at the sudden intrusion, but the big alpha held its ground, a low growl rumbling in its chest. "Hold still," the woman said. Her voice was low, and it wasn't meant for the wolves. It was for him. She pulled the Winchester from its scabbard, the metallic click of her levering around into the chamber echoing off the rocks. The sound froze the nearest wolf in its tracks. She didn't stand. She dropped to one knee, sighting down the long barrel. The first shot cracked the air, kicking up a spray of dirt just in front of the alpha's paws. The beast flinched, its snarl growing louder, but it didn't bolt. "Stubborn," she muttered to herself. She worked the lever again, the rifle becoming a blur of practiced motion. This time she didn't aim at the wolf. She aimed 6 inches to the left of its head. The bullet struck a granite boulder, and the impact sent a shower of sparks into the gloom. The sharp ricochet whined off into the pines. That was enough for the smaller wolves. They broke and fled, melting back into the shadows. But the alpha lingered, pacing a slow half-circle, its yellow eyes still fixed on Keo, as if weighing its chances. The woman rose to her feet, the rifle still trained on the wolf's chest. "Go on," she said, her voice now edged with steel. The wolf's ears twitched. It gave a single huffing bark of defiance, and then, as if making a decision, it turned and vanished into the darkness after the others. The clearing fell into a sudden, ringing silence. The only sound was the wind sighing through the great pine. The woman slung the rifle over her shoulder and walked toward Keo. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the determined set of her jaw. She smelled of leather, dust, and gunpowder. "Who did this to you?" she asked, her eyes flicking from the rawhide on his wrist to the bloody gash on his forearm. A wry, humorless smile touched Keo's lips. "Does it matter right now?" She studied him for a long moment, then drew a formidable skinning knife from a sheath on her belt. "No," she said. "I suppose it doesn't." The blade was wickedly sharp. She slid it under the knot on his chest and worked with quick, efficient movements, her focus entirely on the rawhide. The cord gave with a dry snap. She pulled it free, then moved behind him to the bindings at his wrists. "You've lost blood," she noted, her voice flat. "Not enough to slow me." The last knot came free, and his hands dropped to his sides, numb and tingling. He flexed them, the feeling of pins and needles excruciating as the blood rushed back. Mary Lane, as he would come to know her, stepped back, giving him space. "Can you walk?" He rolled his shoulders, testing his balance. "I can walk." "Good," she said, retrieving her rifle. "We don't want them circling back. Wolves are like men. Give them time to think, and they'll try again." She led him to the mare. The animal eyed him wearily, its ears flicking at the scent of blood. "Easy, Daisy," Mary soothed, patting the horse's neck. Keo swung up behind her on the saddle. The trail was too narrow to ride double otherwise, and the closeness was a necessity he didn't question. He gripped the cantle, his other hand resting on his thigh. As they rode away from the ridge, a thought struck him. He remembered the small pouch at the base of the tree, the strange lump inside. It was still there. He hadn't had time to check it. What was it? A final taunt from his accusers? Or something more? For a moment he considered telling the woman, asking to go back, but the howl of a lone wolf, closer than before, changed his mind. Whatever was in that pouch would have to wait. Survival came first. The trail dipped into a wash where the air was cool and smelled of damp earth. "You were a long way from help," Mary said finally, breaking the silence. "I wasn't looking for help." "Then what were you looking for?" His answer was a long time coming, spoken into the darkness behind her. "Water, the truth, and the man who stole both from me." Mary's jaw tightened as if she wanted to ask more, but she let it go. She pointed ahead to a low saddle between two hills. "My place is on the other side. Mule Creek Station. You're welcome to water, food, and a patch of floor for the night. After that, we'll see." They rode down into a small basin where a single lantern glowed in the window of a stone and timber cabin. It looked small but solid, defensible. As they dismounted, Keo looked back towards the ridge. He couldn't see the tree, but he could feel it. And he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left more than just a pouch behind. He'd left a piece of a puzzle, a clue that might be the key to his entire ordeal. But what he didn't know was that Mary Lane held another piece of that same puzzle. And soon, those pieces were going to crash together. The cabin was one room, plain but orderly. Everything had its place. A rack of tack on one wall, boots lined up by the door, and her Winchester propped within easy reach of the stove. There was nothing soft or unnecessary in the room, much like the woman herself. She handed him a tin cup of water from a stone cistern. "Drink slow," she commanded. The water was cool and life-giving. As he drank, he watched her. She moved with a quiet efficiency, never wasting emotion. She didn't ask if he was hungry. She simply put a pot of beans on the banked fire in the hearth. "You'll want to clean those cuts," she said, gesturing to a basin of water and a bar of harsh carbolic soap. He washed his forearms, gritting his teeth as the soap bit into the open wound. When he turned, she was leaning against the counter, arms folded, watching him with an unnerving intensity. "You handle pain well," she observed. "I've had practice." A draft rattled the door, and she crossed the room to slide a heavy wooden bar into place. "You can take the bed," she said, not looking at him. "I'll take the chair by the fire." He started to object, but the look in her eyes stopped him. "It's my house, my choice." The bed was in a small adjoining room, narrow but clean. He could see her silhouette in the dim firelight from the doorway. He lay down but didn't sleep. The wind hissed outside, and far off, a wolf howled. He saw her head tilt. She'd heard it too. Hours later, he woke to see her standing in the open doorway, her rifle in hand, scanning the darkness beyond the corral. She was a guardian, a protector, but what was she protecting? Or who was she watching for? This wasn't just caution. This was the habit of a woman expecting war. When morning came, she was already frying bacon. "Coffee's there," she said. "You were out late," he stated. "Something moved near the fence," she replied, her voice casual, but her eyes were not. She slid bacon and biscuits onto a plate and set it on the table. "Eat. Then you can tell me whether trouble is going to come riding up my road looking for you." He took a slow sip of coffee. "It might." A flicker of something, not fear but resolve, hardened her face. "Then we'd better be ready for it." After a moment of silence, she looked him dead in the eye. "Last night, when I cut you down, I saw you looking back at the tree. What did you leave there?" He hesitated, then told her about the pouch, the odd lump inside. Probably just a rock, a final joke. "Maybe," she said, her gaze distant. "Or maybe not. My husband used to say the smallest things tell the biggest lies." She pushed a small, worn leather pouch across the table. "He carried this. Always. Said it was for emergencies." She opened it, and a single coin fell out onto the rough-hewn wood. It was silver, but not like any coin Keo had ever seen. It was crudely stamped with the image of a coiled snake. Keo stared at it. His blood ran cold. He had never seen a coin like this before. So the lump in the pouch at the tree. Could it be? Before he could process the thought, Mary spoke again, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. I found that coin on the ground next to my husband's body 5 years ago. He was a government agent, investigating a band of mercenaries selling secrets to the highest bidder. They ambushed him north of here. The leader of that band was a man with a brutal scar across his cheek. Her eyes, hard as agate, locked onto his. Tell me again about the men who accused you. Keogh's story tumbled out then. Not just the accusation, but the man behind it. A rival warrior, a man known for his cruelty and his ambition. A man who had recently returned from a long journey with new wealth and new ugly scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. A man they called Scar Cheek. The air in the cabin grew thick and heavy. This was no longer just about a tribal dispute or a false accusation. The coin on the table, the pouch at the tree, and the scar on his enemy's face were all threads of the same rope. A rope that had hanged Mary's husband and had been meant to hang Keogh. They were both caught in the same web, spun by the same spider, and that spider was closer than they could ever imagine. That same morning, while repairing a fence rail, they saw them. Two riders on the distant ridge, just silhouettes against the pale sky. They watched for a long moment before disappearing over the rise. Scar Cheek's men, Keogh said, his voice flat. They weren't just looking. They were scouting. They know you're here, Mary stated. It wasn't a question. I need to ride into town for flour and lamp oil. She paused, her eyes scanning the ridge. And for information. You stay here. Keep the doors barred. If anyone rides up, make sure they see that Winchester before they see your face. The road into town was quiet, but Mary felt a prickling on the back of her neck. As she rounded the last bend before Main Street, she saw two unfamiliar horses tied outside the saloon. One of them had a distinctive brand on its flank, a coiled snake. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her head down, went straight to the mercantile. Mr. Harding, the old shopkeeper, greeted her with his usual nod. Flour, lamp oil, she said, her voice steady. Then she added, and a box of 44 cartridges. Harding's eyebrows went up. Expecting company, Mary? Just making sure I'm ready for it, she replied. When she stepped back outside, two men were leaning against the hitching rail. One was broad-shouldered with a drooping mustache. The other had a jagged, puckered scar running down his cheek. It was him, Scar Cheek. He looked straight at her, a predatory smile spreading across his face. You, Mary Lane? She didn't flinch. Who's asking? Looking for an Apache man. Calls himself Keogh Redhawk. Her face was a mask of indifference. Don't know anyone by that name. His smile widened, showing stained teeth. He knew she was lying. If you see him, tell him some folks want to talk about some silver coins he might have misplaced. He was toying with her, letting her know that he knew. She pushed past them without another word, loaded her supplies, and mounted Daisy. She could feel their eyes on her back as she rode away. She didn't go straight home. She cut across a dry creek bed, using the cottonwoods for cover, approaching her property from the back. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. This wasn't just a hunt for Keogh. The mention of the coins was a direct threat, a message. Keogh was on the porch when she returned, rifle in hand. Two men in town, she said, swinging down from the saddle. One of them had the scar. She told him about the conversation, about the coiled snake brand, about the veiled threat. Keogh didn't look surprised. They're not just hunting me. They're trying to clean up loose ends. He looked at the cabin, then at the vast, empty land around them. They know this is the only place I could have gone. As the sun began to set, casting long, menacing shadows across the basin, they saw the dust plume. Two riders heading straight down their lane. Mary moved to the porch, her Winchester already in her hands. Keogh stood beside her, his stance loose but ready. It was Scar Cheek and the other man. They stopped at the gate. We were hoping to have a word, Scar Cheek called out, his voice laced with mock courtesy. From there's fine. Mary's voice was flat and cold as a river stone. Scar Cheek's eyes flicked to Keogh. You've got something that doesn't belong to you, Lane. He's not a something, she shot back, and he's under my roof. The man's smile finally faded. That's a mistake. He paused, then his eyes glinted with a cruel light. You know, we paid a visit to your friend Harding at the Mercantile. He was surprisingly talkative. Seems he remembered selling your husband a map just before he died. A map to some old Apache silver mine. Mary's blood ran cold. The map. It was a lie, a fabrication, but it was a dangerous one. Scarcheek continued, his voice rising. Funny thing is, your man Red Hawk here was seen near that same mine just last week. Maybe you two are partners. He was twisting the narrative, painting them both as thieves. Keo stepped forward. You come any closer and you won't ride back. Suddenly another rider appeared on the ridge behind them. And another. And another. There were 5 of them now, fanned out, blocking any escape. This wasn't a conversation. It was a siege. Scarcheek laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. We'll be back, he snarled, after dark, and we'll take what's ours. The man, the map, and the silver. They wheeled their horses around and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence behind them. Mary and Keo looked at each other. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about clearing Keo's name. They had been drawn into a conspiracy that was far deeper and more dangerous than either of them had realized. A conspiracy centered around a mythical silver mine and a lie that was now big enough to get them both killed. They went inside and Keo slid the heavy bar across the door. They'll come at night, he said. Mary nodded, her face grim. Then we'll be ready for them. But as the wind began to howl outside, carrying a faint, mournful cry across the flats, they both knew that being ready might not be enough. The hunters were circling, and their sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. The wind never settled that night. It clawed at the small cabin, rattling the windows and whispering threats through the cracks in the walls. Mary banked the fire, letting the room stay warm without spilling light into the yard to make them easy targets. Keo sat at the table, methodically cleaning his rifle. The soft scrape of the cleaning rod, a rhythmic, calming sound in the tense silence. You ever shoot in the dark? She asked, her voice low. Not by choice, he replied without looking up, but a man learns. Tonight might be one of those nights you learn again. Suddenly a sound cut through the wind. It wasn't the clatter of hooves. It was a low, rolling growl, much closer than the mournful howls from the ridge. Wolves, Keo said, his hand stilling on the rifle. Mary moved to the window, peering into the inky blackness. A shadow moved along the fence line. Then another. They were low and quick, weaving through the tall grass. They're bold tonight, she breathed. Keo stood, loading cartridges into his rifle, his movements fluid and economical. They're hungry. Or maybe, he added, his eyes meeting hers, they were sent. The thought hung in the air, chilling and monstrous. Could Scarcheek and his men somehow be using the wolves? It seemed impossible, but out here, the line between the natural and the sinister was terrifyingly thin. They doused the lamps, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of the embers in the hearth. Outside, the wolves began to circle, their eyes catching the thin moonlight like chips of pale, cold fire. There were more than before, a full pack. Keo eased the front door open a crack, stepping onto the porch. Mary followed, her own Winchester held at the ready. The Alpha, the same pale rough brute from the ridge, stopped just beyond the fence, its head low, a growl vibrating in its chest. Keo lifted his rifle but didn't fire. Wait, he whispered. They're a distraction. His words proved prophetic. From the darkness beyond the cottonwoods to the east, the faint creak of saddle leather reached them. Mary's finger tightened on the trigger. They were using the wolves to cover their approach, drawing their attention to the front while they moved in from the flank. 2 figures on horseback emerged from the shadows. She recognized the broad shoulders of Scarcheek. He thought he was clever. He was about to find out how wrong he was. Mary didn't aim at him. She didn't waste a shot on the men. She aimed at the wolves. She sighted on the Alpha, the leader of the pack, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot shattered the night. The big wolf yelped, a high, surprised sound, and dropped in the grass. The pack, leaderless and confused, scattered in an instant, their aggressive snarls turning to panicked yelps. Scarcheek cursed loudly, caught completely off guard by the sudden chaos. He'd lost his cover. His partner tried to follow him as he wheeled his horse away, but Keogh's shot rang out, splintering the top rail of the fence post right next to the man's head. The rider yelped and dug his heels into his horse, the both of them vanishing back into the night. But it wasn't over. Three more of Scar's men, who had been creeping up on foot toward the barn, now opened fire on the cabin. Bullets splintered the wooden porch posts and thudded into the stone walls. Mary and Keogh scrambled back inside, the heavy door slamming shut behind them. "They're trying to pin us down," Mary yelled over the gunfire. Suddenly, a new smell filled the air, acrid and sharp. Smoke. A horrifying orange glow began to flicker through the kitchen window. "The barn!" Keogh shouted. "They've set the barn on fire!" They were trapped, pinned down in the front, with a growing inferno threatening to engulf them from the back. The heat was already palpable. Daisy and the other horses were screaming in terror from the corral. This wasn't just an attack. It was an execution. Scarcheek wasn't trying to capture them. He was trying to burn them out, to erase them from the face of the earth. Mary grabbed a bucket of water from the cistern. "We have to save the horses." "It's a trap," Keogh warned. "They want us out in the open." The roar of the fire was growing louder, a hungry beast consuming everything in its path. The roof of the barn sagged, sending a shower of sparks into the wind-whipped night. They had seconds to make a choice: stay inside and be cooked alive, or run outside into a hail of bullets. Keogh looked at the barred door, then at the blazing fire through the window. Then he looked at Mary. A grim understanding passed between them. There was no escape. There was only the fight. "They think they have us in a box," Keogh said, his voice dangerously calm as he checked the load in his rifle. "Let's show them what happens when you corner a wolf." He smashed the glass of the front window with the butt of his rifle. "Get ready," he said to Mary. "On my signal, we give them a fight they'll never forget." The fire raged. The bullets flew, and inside the small cabin, two people prepared to make their final stand. "Now!" Keogh roared. He and Mary opened fire simultaneously from two different windows, creating a devastating crossfire. The sheer volume and accuracy of their shots caught Scar's men by surprise. One of the gunmen near the fence cried out and fell silent. The others scrambled for better cover. It was the opening they needed. "The horses!" Mary yelled. While Keogh laid down suppressing fire, she unbarred the door and sprinted into the terrifying, fire-lit chaos of the yard. The heat from the burning barn was like a physical blow. Embers rained down around her. She reached the corral gate, her hands working frantically at the latch as the panicked horses screamed and kicked at the rails. Another of Scar's men rose from behind a water trough, leveling his pistol at her. Before he could fire, Keogh's rifle cracked from the cabin doorway, and the man crumpled to the ground. The gates swung open. The horses, wild with terror, bolted out into the darkness of the open flats, away from the fire and the gunfire. They were safe, but Mary was now exposed, silhouetted against the roaring inferno. Scarcheek, seeing his opportunity, stepped out from behind the cover of the well. "It's over, Lane," he bellowed, raising his own rifle. But Keogh was already moving. He didn't run towards Mary. He ran the other way, a ghost in the flickering shadows circling around the side of the cabin. He used the chaos and the blinding light of the fire to his advantage, his Apache tracking skills turning the familiar yard into a deadly hunting ground. The last of Scar's gunmen realized his partner was gone and turned his attention towards the cabin, trying to pin Keogh down. It was a fatal mistake. Mary, no longer needing to protect the horses, dropped to one knee, brought her Winchester to her shoulder, and fired. The man spun around and fell. Now it was just 2 against 1, or so they thought. Scarcheek, enraged, fired at Mary, the bullet kicking up dirt at her feet. She dove behind the stone wall of the well as he advanced, firing relentlessly. He was so focused on her, so consumed with finishing her off, that he never saw Keogh coming. Keogh burst from the darkness behind him, not with a rifle but with the skinning knife Mary had used to cut him free. He moved with a terrifying speed and silence. He slammed into Scar from behind, and the two men went down in a brutal tangle of limbs. Scar's rifle flew from his hands. He rolled over, pulling his own knife, the blade glinting in the firelight. The two men fought with a savage intensity, a whirlwind of fists and flashing steel. It wasn't a soldier's fight. It was a brawl, fueled by pure, raw hatred. Mary could only watch, her rifle trained, waiting for a clear shot that never came. Meanwhile, a new danger was emerging. The fire, fanned by the relentless wind, had jumped from the barn to the dry grass of the yard. A wall of flames was now creeping steadily toward the cabin itself. Their sanctuary, their fortress, was about to become their tomb. Keo and Scar were locked in a desperate struggle. Scar was bigger and heavier, but Keo was faster, using his opponent's weight against him. He managed to twist Scar's arm, forcing him to drop his knife. Roaring with fury, Scar landed a heavy blow to Keo's head, dazing him for a second. It was all the opening he needed. Scar scrambled away, not for his rifle, but for the shadows. He was retreating. Keo staggered to his feet, blood dripping from a cut on his temple. "He's getting away!" "Let him go!" Mary yelled, pointing towards the cabin. The porch was now on fire. "We have to get out!" They grabbed what they could, rifles, ammunition, a canteen of water, and fled the burning cabin just as the roof began to collapse with a deafening roar. They ran out into the open flats, the fire at their backs, and watched as their home was consumed by the flames. Everything was gone. The barn, the cabin, their sanctuary. All of it reduced to ash and embers. They stood there in the darkness, breathing heavily, the smell of smoke filling their lungs. They had survived. They had won the battle, but they had lost everything. They were homeless, exposed, with a wounded and vengeful enemy still lurking in the night. As the last wall of the cabin fell in on itself, sending a geyser of sparks into the sky, Keo noticed something on the ground, exposed by the firelight. It was a small leather satchel, dropped by one of Scar's men during the fight. He picked it up. Inside there was no coin, no map to a mythical mine. There was something far more real and far more damning. It was a deed of sale for the water rights to Mule Creek, the very creek that fed Mary's land in the surrounding territory. The document was signed by two people, Scar Cheek and the town sheriff. And then Keo saw the date. It was dated for tomorrow. The attack tonight wasn't just to kill them. It was to clear the last obstacle before they seized control of the entire basin's water supply. This conspiracy wasn't just about greed. It was about absolute power. "Mary," Keo said, his voice grim as he held up the paper, "I think our fight is just beginning." Dawn broke over a scene of utter devastation. The cabin was a smoldering ruin, the barn a skeleton of charred timbers. The air was thick with the stink of wet ash and defeat. Mary stood staring at the wreckage, her face a stoic mask, but Keo could see the tremor in her hands. This place had been her life, her fortress against the world, and now it was gone. "He won't stop," she said, her voice hollow. "As long as we're alive, we're a threat to his plan." Keo looked at the deed in his hand. The sheriff's signature was the key. This went beyond a band of thugs. It was sanctioned by the law in the nearest town. They had no one to turn to, nowhere to run where they wouldn't be hunted. "Then we don't run," Keo said, a new fire kindling in his eyes. "We stop them. For good." "How?" "It's us against all of them. Scar, the sheriff, whoever else they've paid off. We have something they don't," Keo said, tapping the deed. "We have the truth, and we know their plan. They need this land, this water. They think we're broken, scattered. They'll get careless." He looked towards the distant mountains, towards the land of his people. "And I know a place they will never think to look for us." They salvaged what little they could, a few tools, a blackened pot, and their weapons. They caught two of the spooked horses miles away in the flats and rode east, away from the town, away from the smoldering ashes of Mule Creek Station. They rode into the Dragoon Mountains following hidden trails that only the Apache knew. They made a cold camp in a rocky alcove high up on a cliffside, a place that offered a commanding view of the trails below. For 2 days they rested, healed, and watched. Keo taught Mary how to move silently, how to read the signs of the land, the subtle language of a broken twig or a disturbed stone. Mary, in turn, showed him how to precisely sight his rifle for long distances, how to account for wind and the drop of a bullet. They were no longer a homesteader and an outcast. They were a unit, forged in fire and bound by a common enemy. On the third day, Keo saw what he was waiting for. A lone rider, heading not towards the ruins of the station, but towards an old abandoned mine shaft deep in the canyons. It was his cousin, Tony. "He's one of them," Mary said, raising her rifle. "Let me take him." "No," Keo said, putting a hand on her arm. "He's not a leader. He's a follower. And he's scared. He's my blood. Let me talk to him." Keo slipped down the cliff face like a shadow, intercepting Tony on the trail. The younger man was terrified, his eyes wide with fear and guilt. "They made me," Tony stammered, his voice cracking. "Scar said he'd tell the council I was the one who helped him, that he'd kill my mother if I didn't do what he said." "What did he tell you to do?" Keo's voice was cold, hard. "He's meeting the sheriff at the old mine tonight," Tony confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "They're finalizing the deal. There's a third man coming, a railroad baron from the east. He's the one with the money. They're going to sign the final papers and then they're coming for the tribe. They want our land, Keo. All of it. The water rights are just the beginning." This was the final piece of the puzzle. It was a full-scale takeover, orchestrated by a corrupt sheriff and a greedy industrialist, with Scar Cheek as their muscle. Keo's banishment, the attack on Mary, it was all part of a monstrous plan to displace the Chiricahua and seize their ancestral lands for the railroad. Keo looked at his cousin at the fear in his eyes. He made a decision. "You want to make this right, Tony? You want to wash the shame from your name?" Tony nodded frantically. "Yes, anything." "Then you're going to go to that meeting," Keo instructed. "You're going to act like nothing is wrong, but you're going to do exactly as I say." He brought Tony back to the alcove and explained the desperate, dangerous plan he had formed. It was a wild gamble, a long shot that put all of their lives on the line. They would use the enemy's own greed against them. They wouldn't just stop the deal, they would expose the entire conspiracy, from the bottom to the very top. Mary listened, her face grim. "This is crazy, Keo. If this goes wrong, we're all dead." "If we do nothing, my people are finished and we're dead anyway," he countered. "I'd rather die fighting on my feet than hiding in the rocks." A slow smile spread across Mary's face. "You know," she said, checking the action on her Winchester, "I was hoping you'd say that." That night, as darkness fell over the canyons, a trap was set. Not a trap of ropes and snares, but one of lies, courage, and a single perfectly aimed bullet. The final act was about to begin, and the fate of an entire people hung in the balance. The old mine shaft was a black wound in the side of the mountain. A single campfire burned near its entrance, casting flickering, distorted shadows against the canyon walls. 3 men stood around the fire: Scar Cheek, the bloated town sheriff, and a well-dressed man in a city suit who looked dangerously out of place, the railroad baron. Tony stood nervously to one side, trying to look like a loyal subordinate. He could feel the eyes of the others on him, and his heart hammered in his chest. A few hundred yards away, hidden in the rocks high above the camp, Keo and Mary lay motionless, their rifles trained on the scene below. They had only one chance to get this right. "The deed is signed," the sheriff was saying, holding up a document. "The land and the water are yours, Mr. Blackwood." The Baron Blackwood smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "Excellent. And the Apache problem?" "My men are ready," Scar Cheek grunted. "Once you give the word, we'll clear them out. The council elder, Nash Doe, has already been persuaded to see things our way. He'll order his people to move on, or we'll do it for them." The final sickening betrayal. Keo felt a surge of white-hot rage. Nash Doe, the man who had raised him, had sold them all out. "There's just the matter of the 2 loose ends," the sheriff added, looking at Scar. "The woman and the Red Hawk boy." "They're dead," Scar lied smoothly. "Burned up in their cabin. Nothing left but ashes." It was the signal. Tony, his hands trembling, stepped forward. "Sir," he said to Scar Cheek, his voice a high-pitched squeak, I found something in the wreckage. I thought you should see it." He held out a small leather pouch, the very pouch his own people had left at the base of the tree where Keo was to die. Scar Cheek snatched it from him. "What is it?" He opened it and pulled out a single, crudely stamped silver coin. The coiled snake. Blackwood the Baron stiffened. His eyes narrowed. Where did you get that? From the Apache, Scar said dismissively. It's nothing. That's not nothing. Blackwood's voice was ice. That's the mark of the Culebra cartel, a cutthroat organization I paid a fortune to disappear years ago. If they're operating here, this entire deal is compromised. This was Keogh's gamble. He had given the coin to Tony, coaching him on what to say, hoping to sow discord among the conspirators. He knew from Mary's story about her husband that the coin represented a dangerous, unpredictable element. The Apache is part of the cartel, Tony blurted out, following Keogh's script. He told me before he died. He said they were coming to take this land for themselves. Panic flickered in the sheriff's eyes. Scar looked confused, then angry. That's a lie. Is it? Blackwood snapped, taking a step back from them. Or have you been playing me for a fool this whole time, Sheriff? Did you make a deal with the Culebras behind my back? The alliance, built on a foundation of greed, was shattering. The men turned on each other, voices rising in accusation. It was the moment of chaos Keogh had been waiting for. Now, Mary, he whispered. High above, Mary took a steadying breath, lined up her sights, and gently squeezed the trigger. The shot was not aimed at a man. It was aimed at the lantern hanging from a dead tree branch over the camp. The rifle cracked, and the lantern exploded, plunging the entire scene into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the dying campfire. In the same instant, Keogh let out a piercing cry, the war cry of the Chiricahua Apache. It echoed through the canyon, multiplied by the rock walls until it sounded like a dozen warriors were descending upon them. Chaos erupted. The sheriff, thinking he was under attack by a cartel and a war party, drew his pistol and fired blindly into the dark. Blackwood scrambled for his horse, screaming for his guards. Scarcheek, realizing he'd been played, let out a roar of fury and lunged for Tony. But Keogh was already moving. He slid down a shale slope, landing in the camp like a phantom. He met Scar's charge, not with a weapon, but with the raw fury of a man fighting for his soul. The two men crashed together, a brutal final confrontation in the firelight. Above, Mary worked the lever of her rifle, firing shot after shot, not at people, but at the rocks around them. The ricochets and the thunderous reports of the Winchester made it sound like an army was attacking. Blackwood's hired guards, terrified, broke and ran. The sheriff, caught in the open, was hit by a ricochet and went down screaming. Tony, his part played, scrambled up the rocks towards safety. It was down to Keogh and Scar. They battled back and forth, but Scar, blinded by rage, was no match for Keogh's focused purpose. Keogh disarmed him, then delivered a series of punishing blows that left Scar broken and gasping on the ground. It was over. As silence fell over the canyon, Mary made her way down. They tied up Scar and the wounded sheriff. Blackwood was long gone. They gathered the signed deeds, the proof of the entire conspiracy. But there was one loose end. Elder Nash Doe. The next day, Keogh and Mary rode into the Chiricahua camp. Not as outcasts, but as victors. They brought their prisoners and their proof. They laid the deeds before the tribal council. Keogh told them everything. The lies, the conspiracy, the railroad, the planned theft of their land. Then he faced Elder Nash Doe. Why? Keogh asked, his voice thick with pain. The old man's shoulders slumped. His face, already a mask of wrinkles, seemed to age another 100 years. I was weak, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. They threatened to withhold government rations. Our children were starving. I thought I was saving us by sacrificing a small piece of land. I never knew the full extent of their plan, and I was wrong to condemn you, my son. I let fear poison my heart. Justice was swift. Scarcheek and the sheriff were handed over to the U.S. Marshals, along with the evidence against Blackwood, sparking a massive federal investigation. Nash Doe was stripped of his status as elder, a punishment worse than death in his eyes. Tony, for his role in their victory, was tasked with a long penance of service to the tribe to earn back his honor. Keogh's name was cleared. He was offered a place on the council, a position of great respect. His people hailed him as a hero, the man who had saved them. But as he stood there, surrounded by the family that had once cast him out, he found his gaze drifting towards the horizon, towards the west. He had saved his past, but his future was somewhere else. A week later, he rode back to the blackened ruins of Mule Creek Station. He found Mary already there, hammering a new fence post into the ground. She looked up as he approached, a small, knowing smile on her face. She didn't ask if he was staying. She didn't need to. He dismounted and picked up a hammer, walking over to help her. They worked in a comfortable silence for a long time, the rhythmic sound of their hammers the only noise in the vast, quiet basin. "If you stay," Mary said finally, not looking at him, "you'll have work to do. Fences don't mend themselves." Keo looked at her, at the quiet strength in her profile, at the endless expanse of land that they had fought for and won. "And I hear," he replied, the corner of his mouth turning up in a genuine smile, "that you're not hauling all the water alone." They had both been left for dead, betrayed by the people they trusted. But in the ashes of their old lives, they had found something new. Not just a partnership, but a home. And out there, in the wide, unforgiving land, under the vast, watchful sky, they were finally ready to build it. If this story of courage, betrayal, and hard-won justice found a place in your heart, do me a huge favor and smash that like button. And if you want to hear more stories about the moments that define us, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you don't miss a single update. Your support means the world and allows me to keep bringing these stories to you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.